Some men are defined by a single moment. Others are shaped by a lifetime of fire and blood. JANGO FETT belonged to neither category. He was forged across decades, tempered by loss, honed by war, and ultimately transformed into something the galaxy had never quite seen before. Not just a warrior, not just a survivor, but a template for millions. His story doesn't begin with the gleaming spires of Kamino or the dusty arenas of Geonosis. It begins much earlier, on a world most people had never heard of, in the quiet years before the galaxy tore itself apart. The seeds of a warrior, the agricultural world of Concord Dawn, hung in the Outer Rim territories, nestled within the Mandalore sector like a forgotten jewel gathering dust. Unlike the gleaming cities of the core worlds or the technological marvels of the Inner Rim, Concord Dawn was a place where people worked the land with their hands, where communities still meant something, and where the old ways persisted beneath the surface of galactic civilization. The planet's russet fields stretched toward horizons that shimmered in the heat. Crops swayed in the persistent wind that swept across the agricultural belts, carrying with it the scent of turned earth and growing things. Small settlements dotted the landscape, clusters of practical buildings designed for function rather than beauty. This was a frontier world, a place where colonists from Mandalore had settled generations ago, bringing with them echoes of a warrior culture that had once dominated entire sectors of space. Born in 66 years before the Battle of Yavin, JANGO FETT entered a world that existed in the shadow of Mandalorian legend. Concord Dawn's population carried genetic markers specific to Mandalorian colonists, and the planet's values reflected its heritage. Strength, self-reliance, honor defined through action rather than words. These weren't abstract concepts on Concord Dawn. They were survival traits in a harsh environment where weakness could mean death and where community bonds meant the difference between prosperity and starvation. The Fett homestead sat in one of the more remote agricultural zones, far enough from the main settlements to offer privacy, close enough to the trade routes to avoid complete isolation. The family farmed the land, coaxing sustenance from soil that could be generous one season and cruel the next. JANGO's father worked as a journeyman protector, one of Concord Dawn's respected lawkeepers. These civilian peacekeepers maintained order across the agricultural colonies, settling disputes, tracking down criminals, and serving as the thin line between civilization and chaos in regions where the Republic's authority existed more in theory than practice. His father had taken over the journeyman protector role after the previous holder, a man named Jaster Merael, had been exiled from Concord Dawn for killing a corrupt superior officer. That act of principled violence had sent Merael into a very different life, one that would eventually intersect with young JANGO's future in ways no one could have predicted. JANGO grew up alongside his older sister Arla in the close-knit family unit that defined life on the Fett farm. The homestead was modest but well-maintained, a testament to the family's dedication to their work and their land. Days began before dawn and ended long after sunset, filled with the endless tasks that farming demanded: tending crops, maintaining equipment, repairing buildings damaged by Concord Dawn's occasional violent storms, protecting the farm from the indigenous creatures that saw cultivated fields as easy feeding grounds. Even as a boy, JANGO showed a natural aptitude for physical tasks. He was quick, coordinated, possessed of the kind of instinctive body awareness that couldn't be taught. His father noticed these traits, recognizing in his son the potential for something beyond farm work. When Django expressed curiosity about the weapons his father carried as a journeyman protector, the older Fett didn't dismiss the questions. Instead, he began teaching the boy the fundamentals of combat, the basics of self-defense, the mental discipline required to survive a fight. These weren't formal lessons, not the kind of structured training Django would receive later. They were moments stolen from the day's work, a demonstration of proper stance while waiting for equipment to be repaired, a discussion of tactical thinking while walking the perimeter of the farm. Bits of wisdom passed from father to son in the ancient tradition of practical knowledge shared through example rather than lecture. The Fett family's connection to Mandalorian heritage ran deeper than simple genetics. Though they were farmers, not warriors, the old values persisted in how they approached life. Strength through adversity, honor in keeping one's word. The understanding that protection of one's family and community came before personal comfort. These weren't lessons explicitly taught so much as absorbed through daily example, woven into the fabric of existence on a world where Mandalorian colonists had established their own distinct culture. Django's childhood, by all accounts, was relatively peaceful. He knew nothing of the great conflicts that had defined Mandalorian history. He understood little of the complex politics that were already beginning to fracture Mandalorian society into competing factions. He was simply a farm boy learning to work the land, growing stronger with each passing season, developing the foundations of skills that would later save his life countless times. At some point during his youth, Django was inoculated against the Keratos plague, a disease native to Concord Dawn that could devastate unprotected populations. This simple medical procedure would prove significant decades later, a small detail that connected him to his home world even after everything he knew there had been destroyed. The boy had no way of knowing that the peaceful existence of his childhood was an anomaly, a brief calm before a storm that had been building for years. Across the Mandalore sector, tensions were rising. Old grudges festered. Philosophical disagreements about the future direction of Mandalorian culture were hardening into irreconcilable positions. Warriors who believed in honor and restraint were clashing with those who wanted to return to the old ways of conquest and raiding. The Mandalorian civil war that would soon engulf Concord Dawn didn't announce itself with fanfare. It crept closer like a predator in tall grass, moving too slowly to be noticed until it was far too late to escape. Fire and ash, the Death Watch attack. Understanding what happened to the Fett family requires understanding the conflict that made it inevitable. The Mandalorian Civil War wasn't a simple dispute. It was a fundamental disagreement about identity, about what it meant to be Mandalorian in a galaxy that had moved beyond the age of warrior cultures and endless conquest. For thousands of years, Mandalorians had been known as the galaxy's most fearsome warriors. They had fought the Jedi. They had carved out empires through strength of arms. They had made their reputation not through technology or numbers, but through individual skill and the unbreakable will of warriors who knew no retreat. But centuries of defeat and decline had left Mandalorian culture fractured, with different groups arguing about the path forward. One faction, led by Duchess Satine Kryze, believed that Mandalorians should abandon their warrior past entirely. These new Mandalorians advocated for pacifism, for transformation into a peaceful society that could find prosperity through diplomacy and trade rather than warfare. They held political power on Mandalore itself and sought to reshape Mandalorian culture from the ground up. Another faction, led by a man named Jasta Marrael, took a different approach. Marrael didn't want to abandon Mandalorian warrior traditions, but he believed those traditions needed reform. His vision was of Mandalorians as honorable mercenaries, super commandos who fought not for conquest, but for credits, guided by a strict code of conduct that separated them from common thugs and raiders. Marrael had written down these principles in a text he called the Super Commando Codex, hundreds of guidelines intended to restore honor to Mandalorian clans. His true Mandalorians were professionals. They chose their contracts carefully. They refused jobs that involved harming innocents or betraying previous employers. They operated under a hierarchical structure with clear lines of authority and responsibility. Marrael believed this path could restore Mandalorian prestige while acknowledging the reality that the era of Mandalorian empires had ended. But not all Mandalorians agreed with either vision. Some believed that both the pacifists and Marrael's reformers were betraying everything that made Mandalorian special. These warriors, led by a man named Tor Vizsla, formed a splinter faction they called the Death Watch. They wanted to return to the old ways completely, to restore Mandalorian warrior culture through conquest and violence. They rejected all forms of restraint as weakness, seeing Marrael's codex as a pathetic attempt to water down Mandalorian strength. The Death Watch saw themselves as the true inheritors of Mandalorian legacy. They were willing to do whatever it took to restore what they believed was the proper order: raiding, terrorism, mass murder. All of it was justified in their minds as necessary steps toward reclaiming lost glory. The conflict between Marrael's true Mandalorians and Vizsla's Death Watch had been simmering for years when it finally reached Concord Dawn. Small skirmishes, ambushes, attacks on supply lines, a war fought across multiple star systems with no clear front lines and no mercy for those caught in between. In 58 years before the Battle of Yavin, when Jango was only 8 years old, that war came to his home. Jasta Marrael, now the Mandalore, the traditional leader of all Mandalorian clans, arrived at Concord Dawn with his forces in retreat. The Death Watch had scored victories, scattering the true Mandalorians and hunting them relentlessly. Marrael needed sanctuary, a place to regroup and plan his next move. He turned to his home world, to the man who had replaced him as journeyman protector, hoping for aid in desperate times. Jango's father didn't hesitate. The Fett homestead became a safe house for Marrael and his warriors. Food was shared, injuries were treated, plans were made in the quiet hours of night while Death Watch patrols scoured nearby sectors looking for their prey. It was a dangerous gambit, one that put the entire Fett family at risk. But it was also the right thing to do, by the values that governed life on Concord Dawn. Marrael was a fellow Mandalorian in need. More than that, he was fighting for principles that aligned with the honorable traditions the elder Fett respected. Young Jango didn't fully understand the politics. He saw warriors in armor, heard hushed conversations about battles and strategies, felt the tension that permeated the homestead whenever Mariel's men stood watch at the farm's perimeter. He asked his father questions about the strangers, about why they were hiding, about the footprints he'd seen in the fields. His father's answers were vague, designed to protect the boy's innocence. Just men who needed help. Nothing to worry about. Focus on your chores. But Tor Vizsla was nothing if not thorough. The Death Watch tracked Mariel to Concord Dawn, followed the trail to the Fett farm, and moved with the ruthless efficiency of warriors who had abandoned all pretense of honor. They came at night. Death Watch warriors surrounded the homestead in darkness, cutting off all escape routes before announcing their presence. When Django's father realized what was happening, he tried to negotiate, to buy time, to protect his family from the violence he knew was coming. The Death Watch had no interest in negotiation. They beat the elder Fett, demanding information about Mariel's whereabouts, about his plans, about the strength of his forces. When Django's father refused to give them what they wanted, they intensified the interrogation. The boy watched helplessly as Death Watch warriors brutalized his father, unable to intervene, frozen by the kind of terror that paralyzes children when they first understand that their parents can't protect them from everything. Django's mother tried to intervene, hoping to save her husband, hoped to draw the Death Watch's attention away from him. Her attempt gave young Django an opening. He ran, sprinting into the darkness with Death Watch warriors in pursuit, his heart hammering, his mind unable to process the full horror of what was happening. He ran directly into Jaster Mariel. The Mandalore had been hiding in the fields, waiting for the moment to spring his trap. The Death Watch thought they had cornered their prey. Instead, they had walked into an ambush of their own. Mariel had allowed them to come, had used the Fett homestead as bait, had prepared a counterattack that would teach Vizsla the cost of underestimating the true Mandalorians. But Mariel's tactical victory came too late for the Fett family. By the time the fighting ended, both of Django's parents were dead. His sister Arla had been taken captive by the retreating Death Watch. The homestead that had been his entire world was burning, crops destroyed, buildings reduced to rubble. 8-year-old Jango Fett stood in the ashes of his life, surrounded by warriors in armor, watching smoke rise into the night sky. The Death Watch soldier who had killed his parents was dead as well, shot by Django himself. In a moment of rage and desperation, the boy had grabbed a fallen blaster, aimed by instinct rather than training, and pulled the trigger. His first kill, his first step down a path that would define the rest of his life. Jaster Mariel looked at the orphan boy standing among the ruins and saw something that made him pause. Courage, resourcefulness, the kind of potential that couldn't be taught, only recognized and cultivated. The boy had helped spring the trap that saved Muriel's forces. He had killed a trained warrior despite being barely old enough to lift a blaster. He had survived the kind of trauma that broke grown men. More than that, Mariel felt responsibility. The Death Watch had come to Concord Dawn, hunting him. The Fett family had died because they gave him sanctuary. Their blood was on his hands as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger himself. Honor demanded he make it right, or at least try to do so. Mariel made a decision that would alter galactic history, though he couldn't have known it at the time. He offered to take Django with him, to raise the boy as a true Mandalorian, to give him the training and purpose needed to survive in a galaxy that had just shown him its cruelest face. The true Mandalorians pulled off Concord Dawn, leaving behind a burning homestead and taking with them an orphan boy who would never be the same. Jango Fett's childhood had ended in fire and blood. His education as a warrior was about to begin. Forged in battle, life with the true Mandalorians. The transition from farm boy to Mandalorian warrior doesn't happen overnight. It's a transformation measured in years, built through repetition and discipline, hardened by experiences that test every limit of endurance and will. For Jango Fett, that transformation occurred in the mobile war camps of the true Mandalorians, among warriors who treated battle as both profession and art form. Jaster Muriel didn't simply adopt Jango in the emotional sense. He formally brought the boy into Mandalorian culture through the ancient tradition of foundling adoption. In Mandalorian society, this was one of the highest honors, a recognition that blood mattered far less than the willingness to live by Mandalorian values. Jango would be raised as Muriel's son, taught everything the Mandalore knew, prepared for a life that few in the galaxy could survive. The true Mandalorians were nomadic by necessity. As a mercenary force hunted by the Death Watch, they couldn't maintain permanent bases or predictable patterns. They moved from system to system, taking contracts that aligned with their code, training constantly, and staying one step ahead of Visla's forces. This meant Jango's education occurred aboard troop transports and in temporary camps, in the brief calm between battles, in stolen moments when experienced warriors could pass knowledge to the next generation. Muriel himself served as Jango's primary mentor. The Mandalore was a complex figure, a man who had killed his corrupt superior officer on principle and been exiled for choosing honor over authority. He was deeply pious, devoted to Mandalorian traditions, even as he sought to reform them. He was an extraordinary soldier, skilled enough to rise to leadership among the galaxy's greatest warriors. But more than his combat abilities, Muriel possessed the leadership qualities needed to unite disparate clans under a single banner. He believed that Mandalorians could be both warriors and honorable beings. That strength didn't require cruelty. That victory through skill and discipline was more meaningful than victory through numbers or savagery. These principles were embedded in the Super Commando Codex, but Muriel taught them by example as much as through direct instruction. The Codex itself became Jango's guide to understanding what separated the true Mandalorians from other warrior cultures. It laid out hundreds of specific guidelines for conduct: never kill unless the contract demands it, never harm innocents, never betray an employer, always honor agreements, choose contracts based on the character of those hiring you, not just the credits offered, treat defeated enemies with respect, care for your warriors as brothers and sisters, maintain your equipment, train constantly, never allow arrogance to replace preparation. These weren't abstract philosophical principles. They were practical rules designed to create a military force that could command premium rates by offering not just combat effectiveness, but reliability and honor. Employers who hired the true Mandalorians knew the job would be completed exactly as specified, with no unpleasant surprises, no betrayals, no atrocities that might create political complications. For young Jango, absorbing the Codex meant more than memorizing rules. It meant internalizing a complete worldview, a framework for making decisions in situations where there were no clear right answers. The Codex taught him to think tactically and ethically simultaneously, to consider not just whether he could accomplish something, but whether he should. The physical training was relentless. Even as a boy, Django was pushed to his limits and beyond. Hand-to-hand combat, weapons proficiency with every weapon system the Mandalorians employed, tactical planning, survival skills, piloting, demolitions, communications, medical training, languages, every skill a warrior might need in the field. Django learned through repetition until competence became instinct. But the true Mandalorians understood that individual skill meant little without discipline and coordination. Django trained not just alone, but as part of squad units, learning to operate as one component of a larger tactical machine. He learned to read the battlefield, to anticipate his companions' movements, to trust his life to warriors he'd fought beside. This wasn't the kind of trust that came from sentiment. It was the practical understanding that Mandalorian combat doctrine relied on each warrior fulfilling their role with absolute precision. The armor became part of who he was. Mandalorian armor wasn't just protection, it was identity, legacy, technology, and art combined. The Beskar plates could withstand blaster bolts and lightsaber strikes. The helmets contained advanced targeting systems, communications arrays, and environmental controls. But more than its technological capabilities, the armor represented belonging. When Django first donned the armor that marked him as a true Mandalorian, he wasn't just putting on equipment, he was claiming his place in an ancient warrior tradition. As Django grew from child to adolescent to young man, he accompanied the true Mandalorians on their contracts. He witnessed warfare on dozens of worlds, saw how professional soldiers operated, learned to remain calm under fire. The true Mandalorians took jobs across the Outer Rim and beyond, helping planetary governments put down rebellions, protecting trade convoys from pirates, serving as elite shock troops for clients who needed problems solved with minimal collateral damage. These weren't clean, simple conflicts. War never was, but Meriel ensured his warriors adhered to the Codex, even when circumstances made it difficult. When a client tried to add civilian targets to a contract mid-mission, Meriel refused and withdrew his forces, forfeiting payment rather than violating their principles. When a mission succeeded more quickly than anticipated, the true Mandalorians didn't demand additional payment beyond what had been agreed upon. When wounded enemies surrendered, they were treated and turned over to proper authorities, rather than executed in the field. Django absorbed these lessons, understanding that honor wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. It was about maintaining your principles when no one was watching, when violating them would be easier and more profitable, when the galaxy gave you every excuse to cut corners and betray your values. But life among the true Mandalorians wasn't entirely defined by combat and training. There was camaraderie as well, the bonds that formed among warriors who depended on each other for survival. Django formed friendships with other young Mandalorians, warriors like Silas, who would stand with him through the darkest times ahead. There were moments of levity around campfires, stories shared about past battles, jokes told to relieve tension before missions. There was the satisfaction of a job well done, of returning to base after a successful contract, of knowing you'd proven yourself worthy of your armor. Meriel treated Django with the kind of stern affection that defined their relationship. The Mandalorian was not particularly demonstrative with emotion, but his care for his adopted son showed in the time he invested in training, in the opportunities he gave Jango to prove himself, in the small gestures of concern when the boy was injured or struggling. Mariel saw in Jango not just a capable warrior in development, but the potential future of the true Mandalorians. Someone who could carry forward the principles of the Codex into the next generation. Years passed in this pattern. The war with the Death Watch continued, an ongoing series of skirmishes and ambushes with neither side able to land a killing blow. Tor Vizsla proved as skilled a commander as he was ruthless, and the Death Watch fought with the kind of fanaticism that made them dangerous opponents despite their lack of discipline. They didn't care about civilian casualties. They didn't honor agreements. They struck at weakness and retreated when faced with strength. Fighting them was like fighting ghosts who could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish before the true Mandalorians could retaliate effectively. By the time Jango reached his late teens, he had become a full-fledged Mandalorian warrior. He had proven himself in battle countless times. He had internalized the lessons of the Codex so thoroughly that ethical decision-making was automatic, not requiring conscious deliberation. He had earned the respect of warriors who had fought beside him, men and women who knew they could trust him with their lives. The scars of Concord Dawn hadn't faded. Jango still carried the trauma of watching his parents die, of losing his sister to the Death Watch, of seeing his childhood destroyed in a single night, but he had transformed that pain into purpose. He fought not for vengeance alone, but for the principles Mariel had taught him. He fought to protect others from suffering the same losses he had endured. He fought because it was what he had been trained to do, and he was very, very good at it. Jaster Mariel had shaped Jango into exactly what the true Mandalorians needed, a warrior of extraordinary skill, a man who understood honor not as an abstract concept, but as a practical guide for action. Someone who could lead if called upon, but who was also content to follow when someone else was better suited to command. Neither Jango nor Mariel could have known how soon that leadership would be tested. The Death Watch had been planning something for years, biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the heart of the true Mandalorians. That moment was approaching faster than anyone realized, and when it came, nothing would ever be the same again. By 52 years before the Battle of Yavin, 6 years after that terrible night on Concord Dawn, Jaster Mariel believed the Death Watch had been broken. Months had passed without significant contact with Vizsla's forces. Intelligence suggested the Death Watch was scattered, disorganized, reduced to isolated cells that posed nuisance raids rather than existential threats. It seemed, for the first time in years, that the true Mandalorians might finally be free to operate as the mercenary force Mariel had always envisioned, without constantly looking over their shoulders for the next Death Watch ambush. Confidence in warfare is often the prelude to catastrophe. The planet Corda 6 had contracted the true Mandalorians for a standard security operation. Local tensions had escalated into a conflict that threatened to destabilize the entire system. The planetary government needed professional soldiers to suppress the uprising quickly, with minimal civilian casualties and with enough force to deter future rebellions. It was exactly the kind of contract the true Mandalorian specialized in: difficult, requiring precision and discipline, commanding premium rates from clients who understood that quality came at a cost. Jango, now in his mid-teens and proven in numerous engagements, had risen through the ranks to serve as a squad captain. It was a significant responsibility, a marker of trust from Muriel and recognition from his fellow warriors that the orphan boy from Concord Dawn had become someone who could be counted on when lives hung in the balance. For Jango, leading his first unit as a captain represented validation of everything he had worked for, proof that he had earned his place among the true Mandalorians through ability rather than sentiment. The mission on Corda 6 began routinely enough. The true Mandalorians deployed with their usual efficiency, establishing secure positions, coordinating with local forces, preparing to execute the contract with the professionalism that had become their hallmark. Jango led his squad through the initial phases, adapting to the specific conditions of Corda 6's terrain, identifying potential threats, ensuring his warriors were positioned to respond to whatever challenges the operation might present. But Tor Vizsla hadn't been broken. He'd been patient. The Death Watch ambush struck with the kind of precision that only came from extensive planning and intelligence gathering. Vizsla had known about the Corda 6 contract. He had positioned his forces in advance, choosing the perfect moment to attack, targeting not random true Mandalorians, but specific high-value individuals whose deaths would cripple Muriel's command structure. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, the kind of close-quarters combat where superior numbers and surprise could overwhelm even the best-trained warriors. The true Mandalorians fought back with everything they had, but the Death Watch had chosen their ground carefully. What should have been a standard security operation became a desperate struggle for survival, with true Mandalorian blood spilling onto alien soil far from Mandalore. In the midst of this carnage, something worse than the Death Watch attack was unfolding. Montross, Mariel's most trusted lieutenant, his second in command, the warrior who had fought beside the Mandalore through countless battles, Montross saw an opportunity. The details of what happened next would be disputed in the years that followed, but the essential facts were clear enough. During the fighting, when Death Watch warriors engaged Mariel directly, Montross made a choice. Instead of protecting his commander as duty demanded, instead of standing with the man who had trusted him with authority second only to the Mandalore himself, Montross withdrew. He pulled back, leaving Mariel exposed, vulnerable, surrounded by enemies who would show no mercy. Jango didn't know about the betrayal as it happened. He was leading his own squad, fighting desperately to prevent the Death Watch from overwhelming their positions. The battle swirled around him, a nightmare of blaster fire and close combat, of warriors falling, of desperate maneuvers to avoid encirclement and annihilation. Tor Vizsla confronted Jaster Muriel personally. The two men who had defined opposite visions of Mandalorian future met in combat, and in that meeting, Muriel fell. Whether Vizsla's darksaber, the ancient distinctive weapon that served as a symbol of Mandalorian leadership, delivered the killing blow, or whether it was more conventional weapons, the result was the same. The Mandalore, the man who had tried to reform Mandalorian culture, who had written the Super Commando Codex, who had adopted an orphan boy and raised him as a son, was dying. Django fought his way to where Muriel had fallen, arriving too late to prevent the tragedy, but in time to witness its conclusion. The man who had saved him, who had trained him, who had given him purpose when everything else had been stripped away, lay bleeding out, his armor breached, his life measured in moments rather than minutes. Muriel died in Django's arms. There are no adequate words for what that moment meant to the young warrior who cradled his mentor's body. This was the second time Django had watched someone he loved die violently. The second time he had been powerless to prevent loss that reshaped the foundations of his existence. The trauma of Concord Dawn hadn't been an aberration. The galaxy was showing him again that attachment meant vulnerability, that caring for people meant watching them bleed, that power and skill couldn't protect you from the fundamental truth that everything could be taken away in an instant. But Django couldn't afford to process that trauma in the moment. The Death Watch was still attacking. His squad still needed leadership. Warriors who had fought beside Muriel still looked to their surviving commanders for direction. So Django did what Mandalorians did. He compartmentalized. He set aside the grief and rage and horror, locked them somewhere deep where they couldn't interfere with the immediate demands of survival, and focused on getting his people out alive. He carried Muriel's body through the chaos, refusing to leave his mentor behind for the Death Watch to desecrate. Other true Mandalorians rallied to him, forming a protective cordon around their dead Mandalore, fighting their way back to the extraction point where their ships waited. It was a nightmare withdrawal, the kind of fighting retreat that tested every skill and destroyed even experienced warriors' nerve. But Django held his people together through force of will and tactical competence, ensuring that while they had lost their leader, they would not lose everyone else. The true Mandalorians pulled back to their landing zone, battered and bloodied, having suffered casualties that would take years to replace. It should have been a moment for mourning, for honoring the fallen, for beginning the process of choosing new leadership to replace the irreplaceable. Instead, they found Montross waiting for them, already assuming he would be named the new Mandalore. The instant Django arrived carrying Muriel's body, he understood what had happened. Montross showed no surprise at Muriel's death, no shock, no grief. His demeanor was wrong, his positioning strategic rather than defensive, his entire bearing that of a man who had expected this outcome and prepared to capitalize on it. Montross tried to seize control immediately. He announced that both Muriel and Django had fallen in the fighting, that he was the rightful successor by virtue of seniority and combat experience, that the true Mandalorians needed strong leadership in this moment of crisis. It was a calculated play, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the other witnesses to his betrayal had all died in the fighting. But Django was very much alive and very angry. The young warrior exposed Montross's treachery before the assembled true Mandalorians. Muriel hadn't simply fallen in combat. He had been abandoned by his second-in-command, left to die by the man he had trusted most. The betrayal wasn't battle chaos or tactical error. It was deliberate choice, a calculated murder disguised as the fortunes of war. The true Mandalorian's response was immediate and unforgiving. Mandalorian culture had specific codes for dealing with traitors, with those who abandoned their own in battle, with warriors who placed personal ambition above honor and brotherhood. Montross had violated every principle the true Mandalorians held sacred. He had betrayed the Codex. More than that, he had betrayed Jaster Meriel, the man who had written that Codex and united them under its principles. They didn't execute Montross. Death would have been mercy, a clean ending. Instead, they stripped him of his armor and weapons, the worst punishment a Mandalorian could receive, a symbolic death that left the body alive but destroyed identity and belonging. They exiled him, casting him out from Mandalorian society, making him Darmanda, a warrior without clan or honor. For a man like Montross, who had defined himself through his position among the Mandalorians, this was a fate worse than any physical death. Montross left Corda 6 in disgrace, nursing hatred that would only grow more poisonous with time. He would become a bounty hunter, trading on the skills he had learned as a true Mandalorian while abandoning every principle that had made those warriors special. His path would cross Jango's again years later, in circumstances neither could have predicted. But in that moment, he was simply a broken man, cast out by people who had been his family, exiled for sins that couldn't be forgiven or forgotten. With Montross gone, the true Mandalorians faced the question of succession. The Mandalore was dead. His second-in-command had been revealed as a traitor. Who would lead now? The answer to those who had fought beside Jango was obvious. Despite his youth, despite having only recently become a squad captain, Jango had proven himself in ways that transcended rank or experience. He had led warriors through impossible situations and brought them home alive. He embodied the principles of the Super Commando Codex not through rhetoric, but through action. He was Jaster Meriel's adopted son, trained personally by the previous Mandalore, marked by that connection as someone who understood the vision Meriel had died defending. More than any of that, Jango had exposed Montross's betrayal and prevented a traitor from seizing leadership. He had carried Meriel's body from the battlefield when it would have been easier to leave it behind. He had honor, skill, and the kind of quiet competence that inspired confidence rather than demanded it. Warriors who had served under Meriel rallied to Jango. Silas, his friend and fellow soldier, pledged loyalty and encouraged others to do the same. One by one, the true Mandalorians acknowledged what was already obvious. Jango Fett, barely out of his teens, would become the new Mandalore. He would lead the true Mandalorians forward, carrying Meriel's legacy into an uncertain future. Jango accepted the position because refusing it would have meant abandoning the people who had become his family. But he understood the weight of what he was taking on. Leading the true Mandalorians meant more than tactical command. It meant being responsible for preserving Mandalorian honor in a galaxy that didn't value honor. It meant making decisions that would determine whether his warriors lived or died. It meant becoming the embodiment of principles that had gotten his mentor killed. He was young for such responsibility. Too young by any reasonable measure, but the galaxy rarely cared about what was reasonable. It cared about what was necessary. And in that moment, the true Mandalorians needed someone who could hold them together, who could continue the work Meriel had started, who could honor the fallen by refusing to let their deaths be meaningless. Jango became Mandalore, and the true Mandalorians followed him into the darkness that lay ahead. The trap of Galidran. For 8 years, Jango Fett led the true Mandalorians with the kind of competent professionalism that Mariel would have been proud of. The teenage warrior who had inherited leadership through tragedy and necessity grew into the role, developing the judgment and strategic thinking that separated adequate commanders from exceptional ones. Under his leadership, the true Mandalorians not only survived, but thrived, taking contracts across the Outer Rim, building their reputation as the galaxy's finest mercenary force. The Codex remained their guide. Jango enforced its principles as strictly as Mariel ever had, understanding that their honor was what separated them from common thugs. They chose contracts carefully, refusing jobs that would require them to harm innocents or betray their values. They completed every mission exactly as specified, neither exceeding nor falling short of what had been agreed upon. They trained constantly, maintained their equipment to perfectionist standards, and operated with the kind of precision that made them worth every credit they charged. The war with the Death Watch continued, but with Vizsla forced into hiding after Quarter 6, the threat had diminished. The Death Watch still existed, still launched occasional raids, still represented an enemy that could never quite be defeated. But they no longer posed the existential threat they once had. For the first time in years, the true Mandalorians could operate without constantly looking over their shoulders. Jango's leadership style differed from Mariel's in subtle ways. Where Mariel had been the warrior philosopher who wrote the Codex and preached its principles, Jango led primarily through example. He didn't make grand speeches about honor, he simply lived it, making decisions that embodied the values he expected from his warriors. He was younger than most of his subordinates, which could have undermined his authority, but he compensated through sheer competence and the willingness to lead from the front, rather than issue orders from safety. The true Mandalorians expanded during these years, growing from the remnant that had survived Quarter 6 into a formidable force. New recruits joined, attracted by the reputation Jango's leadership had built. Veterans who had doubted whether such a young Mandalore could lead effectively saw their concerns proven unfounded. The organization that Jasta Mariel had founded and Jango had inherited was becoming what it was always meant to be, a disciplined, honorable military force that the galaxy could respect rather than simply fear. But success breeds complacency, and complacency creates vulnerabilities. In 34 years before the Battle of Yavin, 8 years after Jango had become Mandalore, the true Mandalorians received intelligence about Death Watch operations on the planet Galidran. The information suggested that Vizsla had been using the snow-covered world as a base, and that the local governor might be willing to provide support in finally eliminating the threat the Death Watch posed. For Jango, this represented the opportunity he had been waiting for since Concord Dawn. The chance to destroy the Death Watch. The chance to ensure no one else would suffer what he had suffered, what his family had endured, what countless others had lost to Vizsla's fanaticism. It was personal in ways that went beyond tactical considerations, but it also made strategic sense. Eliminating the Death Watch would allow the true Mandalorians to operate without constantly defending against attack from their own kind. The governor of Galidran had hired them ostensibly to deal with an insurrection that threatened his authority. It seemed like a straightforward contract: suppress a rebellion, restore order, collect payment. The kind of job the true Mandalorians had completed dozens of times. But this time, there was additional incentive. The governor indicated that Tor Vizsla and the Death Watch were somewhere on Galadran, and that with the right pressure, he might reveal their location. Jango and his warriors executed the contract precisely as specified. They put down the rebellion with minimal casualties, using overwhelming force and tactical superiority to end the fighting quickly. It wasn't pleasant work, but it was necessary, and they did it without committing the atrocities that made mercenary work a dirty word across civilized space. When the mission was complete, Jango went to the governor to collect payment and, more importantly, to demand information about the Death Watch. He walked into a trap. Tor Vizsla was indeed on Galadran, but not as a fugitive hiding from the governor. He was working with the governor, had been from the beginning, had orchestrated the entire scenario as payback for years of defeats and the humiliation of being hunted across the galaxy. The insurrection the true Mandalorians had put down, those weren't rebels. They were civilians, peacefully protesting against the governor's tyrannical policies. The Death Watch had manufactured evidence making them look like armed insurgents, and the true Mandalorians, trusting the contract they had been given, had followed their orders. But the worst part of the trap wasn't the deception about the contract. It was who Vizsla had convinced to spring the trap with him: the Jedi Order. The governor had contacted the Jedi Council with reports that Mandalorian warriors were massacring peaceful civilians on Galadran. He provided fabricated evidence of atrocities, of war crimes, of exactly the kind of unprovoked violence that would demand Jedi intervention. The Council, hearing reports of Mandalorians killing innocents, dispatched a task force led by a Jedi Master named Dooku and his Padawan Komari Vosa. Count Dooku, at this point in his life, was still a Jedi, still serving the Republic, still years away from the fall to the dark side that would transform him into Darth Tyrannus. He was a formidable duelist, a respected member of the Jedi Council, someone who had dedicated his life to serving the light. He also had a complicated relationship with the concept of Mandalorians, having studied their history and understood them as worthy opponents rather than simple criminals. But even Dooku, with all his experience and wisdom, didn't question the intelligence he had been given. The governor had provided evidence. The reports were consistent, and Mandalorians historically were capable of exactly the kind of violence being described. The Jedi arrived on Galadran believing they were confronting war criminals who needed to be stopped. When Jango returned from meeting with the governor, when Vizsla sprang the trap and the Death Watch attacked, he found his forces engaged not by Vizsla's warriors, but by Jedi. The true Mandalorians, caught completely off guard, tried to defend themselves against opponents they had never expected to face. This wasn't a conflict they had trained for. Fighting the Death Watch was one thing. Fighting Jedi who believed they were bringing mass murderers to justice was something else entirely. The Battle of Galadran was a massacre, but not the one the Jedi had been told about. The true Mandalorians fought with everything they had, understanding that this was their last stand, that there would be no retreat or negotiation. Jedi against Mandalorians, lightsabers against blasters and Beskar, the Force against technology and training, and desperation. The snow of Galidran ran red with the blood of warriors who had done nothing wrong except trust a contract that had been designed to destroy them. Jango killed 6 Jedi in that battle, fighting with the kind of savage desperation that comes from understanding you're about to die and determined to make your death costly for those who brought it about. But individual skill couldn't overcome the tactical situation. The Jedi had surprised them. The Death Watch had provided intelligence on true Mandalorian positions and capabilities. Vizsla had orchestrated the perfect trap, using the Jedi as his weapon to accomplish what he could never have done directly. One by one, the true Mandalorians fell. Warriors who had fought beside Jango for years. Friends, brothers and sisters in arms. People who had trusted him to lead them, who had followed him into what they believed was a simple contract, who died because their Mandalore had been outmaneuvered by an enemy who understood that honor could be weaponized against those who valued it. By the time the fight ended, Jango was the only true Mandalorian left alive. Every single one of his warriors had been killed. The organization that Jaster Muriel had founded, that Jango had led for 8 years, that had represented the hope for a reformed and honorable Mandalorian culture, it was gone, annihilated, destroyed not by the Death Watch directly, but by the Jedi Council acting on false information. Jango, wounded and exhausted, finally surrendered to the Jedi. There was no point in fighting to the death when his people were already dead. Survival in that moment was the only victory available. The Jedi subdued him and delivered him to the custody of Galidran's governor as agreed. Dooku would later claim he sensed something wrong about the entire situation, that his interaction with Jango suggested the Mandalorian wasn't the war criminal he had been described as. But in the moment, with bodies of Jedi and Mandalorians alike scattered across Galidran's snow, there was no time for such nuanced consideration. The Jedi had done what they believed was necessary to stop mass murderers. The fact that they had been manipulated, that they had destroyed honorable warriors based on lies, would only become clear later. The governor, as Vizsla had planned, didn't hold Jango for trial. Instead, he sold the last of the true Mandalorians into slavery. Jango was stripped of his armor, bound in chains, and shipped off-world to work in spice mines that consumed slaves and asked no questions about where they came from. For approximately 2 years, Jango Fett labored as a slave, the orphan boy from Concord Dawn who had been adopted by Mandalorians, who had risen to become Mandalore, who had led the finest warriors in the galaxy, was reduced to the most powerless existence imaginable. He was property, a tool to be used and discarded, a nobody in the bowels of facilities where death came quickly to those who couldn't keep up with the brutal demands. These years broke something in Jango, some essential optimism or belief in justice that he had managed to preserve through all his previous trauma. Watching his parents die had taught him the galaxy was cruel. Watching Mariel die had taught him that betrayal could come from those you trusted most. But Galidran and the slavery that followed taught him a darker lesson, that honor could be used against you, that doing the right thing was no protection, that the galaxy's institutions, even the Jedi Order, could be manipulated into committing atrocities. But slavery also crystallized something in him, a cold, hard resolve that would define the rest of his life. He would survive, he would escape, he would reclaim what had been taken from him, and he would ensure that the Death Watch paid for what they had done, not through grand gestures or dramatic speeches, through methodical, patient, inevitable vengeance. Django used his training to stay alive in the mines. The skills Mariel had taught him, the discipline that had kept him going through countless battles, became the tools he used to endure conditions that killed weaker prisoners. He learned the rhythms of the facility, identified the guards' routines, cataloged every weakness in their security. And when the opportunity finally came, he took it with the kind of ruthless efficiency that his enslavers never expected from a slave. The details of his escape would become legend among those who knew the story. Django killed the guards who had been his captors. He freed other prisoners to create chaos that would cover his departure. He acquired weapons and supplies through combinations of theft and violence. And then he disappeared into the galactic underworld, one more refugee among millions, invisible because no one was looking for a dead man. Free but alone, Django faced a choice about who he would become. The true Mandalorians were gone. The cause Mariel had dedicated his life to was finished. The dream of reformed, honorable Mandalorian warriors had died on Galadran. Django could try to rebuild, to find other Mandalorians and resurrect what had been lost. Or he could acknowledge that chapter of his life had ended and forge something new. He chose the latter, but first, he had unfinished business with Tor Vizsla. Vengeance and rebirth, hunting the Death Watch leadership, required resources Django didn't have and information that took time to gather. He spent months in the galactic underworld, taking odd jobs, building connections with information brokers and black market dealers, slowly piecing together the location of Vizsla's base of operations. This wasn't the kind of hunt he had conducted as a true Mandalorian with full squad support and military intelligence. This was solitary work, the patient accumulation of fragments that would eventually form a complete picture. During this time, Django also focused on recovering what had been taken from him on Galadran. His armor, the Beskar plates that had protected him through countless battles, that represented his identity as a Mandalorian, that connected him to everything Mariel had taught him. Finding Beskar wasn't simple. After Galadran, the armor of dead true Mandalorians had been scattered, sold, lost, or destroyed. But Django was nothing if not persistent, and over time he managed to reclaim enough pieces to reassemble a functional set of Mandalorian armor. It wasn't identical to what he had worn as Mandalore. Some pieces came from different sets, salvaged from black markets or taken from those who had no right to wear them. The color scheme changed from Mariel's gray and red to Django's own distinctive silver and blue. But the important thing was that he had armor again. He had identity again. He was Mandalorian again, even if he was the last Mandalorian who still believed in the principles Mariel had died defending. The armor brought with it something else: capability. Django modified his reclaimed Beskar with weapon systems, gadgets, and technology that transformed it from simple protection into a comprehensive combat platform. Wrist-mounted flamethrowers for close-quarters combat, grappling lines for mobility, jetpack for aerial advantage, knee rockets, wrist blades, all the tools that would make him one of the most dangerous individuals in the galaxy when properly employed. With armor and resources secured, Jango turned his full attention to the Death Watch. His intelligence gathering eventually led him to Corellia, where Vizsla had established what he believed was a secure base of operations. The Death Watch leader, confident that the true Mandalorians had been destroyed completely, had grown careless in ways that would prove fatal. Jango's attack on the Death Watch facility wasn't the kind of straightforward assault the true Mandalorians might have launched. It was surgical, focused specifically on reaching Vizsla, and designed to maximize the psychological impact on the Death Watch leadership. Jango wanted Vizsla to know who was coming for him, wanted him to understand that Galadron hadn't killed everyone, wanted him to face the consequences of his actions before he died. The confrontation between Jango Fett and Tor Vizsla played out across multiple environments. It began aboard the Death Watch's ship as Jango infiltrated the vessel, fighting his way through Vizsla's guards with a kind of methodical efficiency that left bodies in his wake. The Death Watch warriors, accustomed to fighting true Mandalorians who adhered to the Codex's restrictions, found themselves facing something different. Jango wasn't bound by rules anymore. He was bound by one objective: kill Vizsla. The fight moved from the ship to Corellia's surface when Vizsla tried to escape, using atmospheric craft to put distance between himself and his pursuer. But Jango had reclaimed his jetpack and wasn't about to let Vizsla run. The pursuit became a running firefight through Corellia's skies, two Mandalorians employing the full capabilities of their armor and weapons to destroy each other, with the city below serving as backdrop to their personal war. When they finally met face to face on Corellia's surface, both warriors were exhausted, both wounded, both operating on reserves of will and hatred that had sustained them through years of conflict. The duel itself wasn't the elegant choreography of Jedi combat or the precise tactics of military engagement. It was brutal, desperate, two men trying to kill each other with every weapon and technique at their disposal. Jango critically wounded Vizsla, damage severe enough that the Death Watch leader couldn't continue fighting, but not immediately fatal. In other circumstances, Jango might have finished him quickly. But this was Tor Vizsla, the man who had orchestrated the attack on Concord Dawn, who had killed Jango's family, who had killed Jaster Muriel, who had destroyed the true Mandalorians through deception and manipulation. Quick death was too merciful. The smell of blood attracted local predators, dire cats, dangerous pack hunters native to Corellia. Jango left Vizsla to their tender mercies, walking away as the man who had caused so much suffering screamed his last moments. It wasn't the kind of death the Codex would have condoned, but the Codex was written for true Mandalorians, and the true Mandalorians were dead. With Vizsla gone, Jango turned his attention to dismantling what remained of the Death Watch organization. He destroyed their supply caches, eliminated their leadership, and scattered the survivors. The Death Watch would eventually reconstitute under new leadership, but in that moment, Jango effectively broke them as thoroughly as they had broken the true Mandalorians. Revenge accomplished, Jango faced the question of what came next. He was the last of the true Mandalorians. The Codex existed, but there was no one left to follow it. Mandalorian culture, as Muriel had envisioned it, honorable warriors serving as professional soldiers had died on Galadran. Django could spend his life trying to rebuild what was lost, recruiting new warriors, teaching Morale's principles to a new generation. Or he could acknowledge that some things, once broken, couldn't be repaired. He chose to walk away from his role as Mandalore. The title meant nothing without warriors to lead. The responsibility was to people who no longer existed. Django kept his armor, kept his skills, kept the lessons Morale had taught him about tactics and honor and what it meant to be Mandalorian, but he couldn't keep the dream. Instead, he became a bounty hunter. The choice made practical sense. His skills translated directly to bounty hunting work. Tracking targets, combat, survival. Staying off the grid while still operating within the galaxy's legal and illegal structures. He could make a living, potentially a very good living, doing what he had been trained to do without the additional burden of trying to preserve a culture that the galaxy had decisively rejected. But it was also a kind of defeat, an acknowledgement that everything Morale had fought for was finished. Bounty hunting was exactly the kind of profession the Super Commando Codex had been designed to elevate Mandalorians above. It was mercenary work stripped of the higher purpose, skill employed for credits rather than principles. Django would be good at it the best, eventually, but it was a far cry from what he had been trained to be. He acquired his own ship to replace the transport he had once commanded as Mandalore. He called it Jaster's Legacy, a quiet acknowledgement of the debt he could never repay to the man who had saved him, trained him, and trusted him with leadership. The ship became his mobile base, his sanctuary, the one constant in a life that would take him across the galaxy on contracts that ranged from straightforward to suicidal. Jango Fett, the bounty hunter, began building a reputation. In a profession filled with criminals, psychopaths, and barely competent thugs, he stood out for his professionalism and effectiveness. He didn't take every job offered. He didn't torture for information or kill unnecessarily. He operated with a code that, while not the Codex Morale had written, still set him apart from most of his competitors. This approach, ironically, made him more valuable rather than less. Clients who needed someone reliable, who wanted targets delivered alive when specified, who couldn't afford the complications that came with employing sadists or idiots, they sought out Jango Fett. His rates were high, but he delivered results. His word meant something in an industry where most deals were built on mutual distrust. The galaxy's criminal underworld took notice. Other bounty hunters recognized a superior operator in their midst. Jango worked with and against figures who would themselves become legendary. Cad Bane, the Duros, who would eventually be considered the best bounty hunter of the Clone Wars era, trained under Jango for a time, learning from a master before their paths diverged. Aura Singh, the deadly assassin with partial force sensitivity, became an occasional partner. Hondo Onaka, the pirate who would survive through sheer audacity and luck, had encounters with Jango that left him with healthy respect for the Mandalorian's capabilities. Jango also found someone he could trust, or at least trust as much as he trusted anyone. Rosada, a Toydarian who operated Outland Station and served as information broker, deal maker, and finder of contracts for bounty hunters willing to pay her percentage. She was competent, reliable, and genuinely seemed to care about Jango beyond his value as a source of credits. Their relationship was professional, with hints of friendship, the kind of connection that could exist in the underworld between people who had each other's backs without the burden of deeper emotional entanglement. Rosada was one of the few people who encouraged Django to find something to live for beyond credits and the next contract. She saw in him potential that he had stopped seeing in himself. She recognized that beneath the professional bounty hunter was someone capable of more, deserving of more, than solitary existence hunting people for money. Django never found what Rosada wanted for him during those years, but he built a life, if you could call it that. He became the best at what he did. He accumulated wealth and reputation. He proved that his training under Muriel hadn't been wasted, even if he was applying it to purposes Muriel would have found disappointing. And then, a decade after Galadriel, everything changed again. Because Count Dooku, the Jedi Master who had led the task force that destroyed the true Mandalorians, was no longer a Jedi. He had left the Order, fallen to the dark side, and become Darth Tyrannus, apprentice to the Sith Lord Darth Sidious. And the Sith had a plan that required exactly the kind of warrior Django had become, a plan that would transform one man's DNA into millions of soldiers, a plan that would ultimately lead to the destruction of the Jedi Order and the rise of the Galactic Empire, a plan that began with a simple job offer to the galaxy's best bounty hunter. The year was 32 before the Battle of Yavin, shortly after the Trade Federation's failed blockade of Naboo. The galaxy was changing in ways few people understood, with political tensions rising and ancient enemies moving in shadows. For most beings, these were abstract concerns, distant political machinations that didn't affect daily life. For bounty hunters like Jango Fett, they represented potential opportunity. Chaos meant work. Instability created targets. And someone, somewhere, was always willing to pay to have problems solved with blasters rather than diplomacy. Django was operating out of Outland Station, conducting routine business with Rosada, when he received a message that would alter the course of his life and, ultimately, the fate of the galaxy. The hologram that appeared before him showed a figure of refinement and obvious authority. The man introduced himself as Tyrannus, offering a contract unlike any Django had encountered. Not a specific target with specified terms, but an invitation to a hunt. A competition among the galaxy's most lethal bounty hunters, with a prize of 5 million Republic credits and a contract that would, as Tyrannus carefully phrased it, secure Django's financial future completely. The target, Komari Vosa, leader of a criminal organization called the Bando Gora. The terms, dead or alive, though alive, would be preferred for interrogation purposes. The catch, Django wouldn't be the only one hunting. Tyrannus had extended this invitation to several elite bounty hunters, ensuring competition that would test not just combat skills, but strategy, resourcefulness, and the ability to function under pressure. Rosada was immediately concerned when Django told her he was taking the contract. She had heard rumors about the Bando Gora, the cult that brainwashed people with modified death sticks, turning them into mindless fanatics. The organization whose reach extended across multiple sectors, whose members seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Every bounty hunter who had gone after them had vanished without trace, presumably killed or converted into the very thing they had been hunting. But Django wasn't deterred by danger. If anything, the difficulty made the hunt more appealing. 5 million credits would provide security he had never known. More importantly, a contract from someone with Tyrannus's resources and connections could open doors in the bounty hunting world that were currently closed. This was the kind of opportunity that came once in a career, the job that separated the truly exceptional from those who were merely competent. What Django didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Tyrannus was Count Dooku, the same Jedi Master who had led the task force on Galadran. And this hunt wasn't really about eliminating the Bondo Gora, though that was certainly part of it. It was a test, an elaborate audition to find someone who possessed the perfect combination of skills, genetics, and character to serve as the template for an army that would change galactic history. The hunt began on Coruscant, in the planet-wide city's lower levels, where death sticks flowed through criminal networks and law enforcement's authority was more suggestion than reality. Django tracked a dealer named Jervis Gloom through the Uskru Entertainment District, fighting through gang members protecting their product, navigating the kind of urban warfare that required different tactics than battlefield combat. Close quarters, civilians everywhere, limited sight lines, the kind of environment where overwhelming firepower could create more problems than it solved. Gloom, when finally cornered, gave up his supplier, Groff Haug, a mid-level criminal operating a death stick processing facility in Coruscant's industrial zones. Django infiltrated Haug's operation, gathering intelligence on the Bondo Gora distribution network while avoiding security systems and hired thugs. That's where he first encountered Montross, his old enemy from the true Mandalorians. The traitor who had abandoned Jaster Meriel to die was also hunting Vosa. Montross had become everything the Codex warned against: a mercenary with no honor, who killed for pleasure as much as profit, who used Mandalorian training for purposes that shamed the armor he wore. The two former comrades fought briefly, more a skirmish than full battle, before Montross withdrew. But both understood that before this hunt ended, they would face each other again. The investigation led Django to Senator Connus Trell, a Twi'lek politician whose penthouse apartment overlooked Galactic City's most exclusive districts. Trell was involved in the death stick trafficking network, providing political protection in exchange for credits that funded his lavish lifestyle. Django questioned the senator with persuasive techniques that left no physical evidence, but convinced Trell that cooperation was his healthiest option. The senator revealed another piece of the puzzle: a crime lord named Sebulto on Malastari was the next link in the chain leading to Vosa. But Sebulto wasn't easy to reach. The Dug crime lord had placed a bounty on one of his former employees, Bendix Fust, who was currently imprisoned at Uvo 4, a maximum security asteroid prison that didn't welcome uninvited visitors. Django would need to break into Uvo 4, extract Fust, and use the prisoner as bait to get close to Sebulto. During the Uvo 4 prison infiltration, Django encountered a shape-shifting Clawdite bounty hunter named Zam Wessel. She was also after Fust, working her own angle on contracts that intersected with Django's. Their first meeting was adversarial, competition for the same target. But Wessel recognized that Django was operating on a different level than most bounty hunters. Rather than fight to the death over a prisoner, they formed an uneasy partnership, agreeing to work together until their objectives diverged. The prison extraction was complicated by a riot that Django's infiltration inadvertently triggered. Inmates used the chaos to attack guards, settle scores, and attempt escape. Django and Zam fought their way through the mayhem with Fust in custody, reaching Django's ship, not Jaster's Legacy anymore, but a new vessel he had acquired during a previous contract, a Fire Spray 31 patrol craft. The Fire Spray acquisition is worth noting. These ships were manufactured specifically for law enforcement and prison patrol work. Only 6 prototypes existed, all stationed at Uvo 4. During the riot, Django had reached the prison's hangar and found all 6 fire sprays waiting. He chose one, modified its access codes, and flew it out of the hangar. Then, to ensure his new ship was truly unique, he destroyed the other 5 with the fire spray's weapon systems. The ship became Slave Y, named in reference to his years of slavery after Galadran. It was one of the most capable ships in the galaxy, fast, maneuverable, packed with weapon systems that made it as dangerous as any military craft. Django immediately began modifying it, adding upgraded blaster cannons, seismic charges that could devastate anything in their blast radius, and sensor systems that would give him every tactical advantage in space combat. With Fust secured and Slave I acquired, Django and Zam headed to Malastara to confront Sebulto. The Dug's compound was a fortress protected by guards, automated defenses, and the kind of security that deterred all but the most suicidal attackers. Django used Fust as his entry ticket, presenting the prisoner while Zam created a distraction. Inside Sebulto's facility, Django discovered the full scope of the Bando Gora operation. The Death Stick manufacturing wasn't just about drug trafficking. The modified substances contained chemicals that made users susceptible to mental conditioning, transforming them into fanatically loyal servants of Komari Vosa. The Bando Gora wasn't just a criminal organization, it was a cult using addiction and mind control to build an army of devotees who would die without question for their leader. The investigation also revealed that the Hutts were involved in the Bando Gora supply chain. Specifically, Jabba and Gardula, the 2 most powerful Hutts on Tatooine, were in competition for control of Death Stick distribution. This meant Tatooine was Django's next destination. The Tatooine leg of the hunt tested Django in different ways. Desert environments required different tactics than urban combat or facility infiltration. He impressed Jabba the Hutt by eliminating Longo Two Guns and his gang, criminal competitors who had been troubling Jabba's operations. This earned him information about Gardula's involvement with the Bando Gora. Infiltrating Gardula's palace, Django found Zam Wesell already captured. He could have left her, they were competitors after all, and her capture removed one obstacle between him and the prize. But that wasn't how Django operated. He extracted her from Gardula's dungeon, confronted the Hutt crime lord, and fed Gardula to her own pet crate dragon before killing the beast itself. It was the kind of dramatic statement that would become legendary in the underworld, the type of story that other criminals would whisper about for years. The trail finally led to Bogdan's moon, Kolma, where the Bando Gora had established their primary stronghold. Django arrived to find Montross waiting outside Vosa's fortress, ready for their final confrontation. The 2 former true Mandalorians fought with everything they had, using armor systems, weapons, and tactics that Mariel had taught them. But Django had evolved beyond what he'd been as Mandalore. He fought without the Codex's restraints, without concern for honorable victory, focused solely on ensuring Montross didn't get the bounty. Django won the duel, critically wounding his old enemy. Montross, dying, asked for a better death, the mercy killing that warriors sometimes granted defeated opponents. Django refused. Instead, he left Montross for the Bandagora cultists, allowing them to tear apart the man who had betrayed Jaster Mariel. It was cold, brutal, and completely at odds with the principles Django had once fought to preserve. But Montross had destroyed everything the true Mandalorians represented. He deserved no mercy. Entering Vosa's citadel, Django was immediately overwhelmed by Bandagora numbers. They captured him, subjected him to torture and interrogation, trying to break him and convert him into another mindless servant. Komari Vosa personally conducted the interrogation, using psychological techniques refined through years of twisting people's minds. Vosa was a fascinating and tragic figure. Once a Jedi Padawan trained by Count Dooku himself, she had been part of the Galidron task force. What she witnessed there, the slaughter of the true Mandalorians, the realization that the Jedi had been manipulated into committing mass murder, had broken something in her. She had fallen to the dark side, been expelled from the Jedi Order, and eventually taken control of the Bandagora. During Django's interrogation, Vosa mentioned Galadran, recognized him as one of the Mandalorians she had helped destroy. The psychological games she played were designed to break him by reminding him of that trauma, forcing him to confront the fact that she had been part of the force that killed his people. But before Vosa could complete Django's conversion, Zam Wesell arrived. Despite having been left on Tatooine, despite having every reason to abandon Django to his fate, she mounted a rescue operation. It was partially self-interest. She wanted a share of the bounty, but also respect for a fellow hunter who had saved her life. The final battle with Vosa tested every skill Django possessed. She wielded dual lightsabers with expertise born from Jedi training, enhanced by dark side power. She used telekinesis to throw objects as weapons. She employed the same mind manipulation techniques that had created the Bandagora. But Django had spent his entire life fighting Force users, from the Jedi on Galadron to various contracts that had required him to face opponents with abilities beyond normal warriors. He won through tactics, endurance, and the willingness to take punishment that would have killed lesser fighters. When Vosa finally fell, critically wounded but still alive, Django hesitated. Kill her and collect the bounty, or take her alive as Tyrannus had requested? The choice was taken from him when Tyrannus himself appeared. The man Django had known only through hologram stood before him, and with casual force power, choked the life from Komari Vosa. Then Tyrannus explained the truth. There had never been just a bounty. The entire hunt had been an elaborate test to find someone with the perfect combination of skills, genetics, and character to serve as the template for a clone army. Django had passed every test. He had shown tactical brilliance, combat effectiveness, the ability to work with others when necessary, but function alone when required, and most importantly, the discipline to complete missions regardless of difficulty. Tyrannus made an offer. In exchange for serving as the genetic template for this clone army, Django would receive enormous financial compensation enough to never work again if he chose. But more importantly, as part of the agreement, he could request one unaltered clone for himself. a son, a legacy, someone to carry forward what remained of Django's life after everything else had been taken. Django thought of Rosata's words about finding something to live for beyond credits in the next contract. He thought about the true Mandalorians, destroyed because Muriel had tried to build something that would outlast individual warriors. He thought about legacy and what it meant to leave something behind when you died. He accepted Tyrannus's offer with one condition. The unaltered clone would be his completely, raised as his son, free from the accelerated growth and behavioral modifications that would be inflicted on the other clones. The deal was struck. JANGO FETT would become the template for the Grand Army of the Republic, and he would finally have something to live for, beyond survival and vengeance. The template and Kamino. The planet Kamino existed beyond the edge of Republic space, an ocean world perpetually wreathed in storms, home to a species whose mastery of cloning technology was unmatched in the galaxy. The Kaminoans had perfected techniques that other civilizations barely understood, creating living beings from genetic templates with precision that bordered on art. It was here that JANGO FETT traveled after accepting Tyrannus's contract, leaving behind the life of a bounty hunter for something he couldn't quite define yet. The Kaminoans welcomed him with the clinical professionalism that characterized their species. To them, Django was the prime clone, the genetic source from which millions of soldiers would be derived. They were interested in his DNA, his physical capabilities, his mental attributes, everything that made him an effective warrior translated into genetic data they could replicate. The process began immediately. Genetic sampling, medical examinations, psychological evaluations. The Kaminoans wanted comprehensive data on every aspect of Django's biology and psychology. They mapped his genome with incredible precision, identifying the specific markers that gave him his reflexes, his physical conditioning, his natural aptitude for combat. But the Kaminoans weren't just copying Django's DNA. They were improving it from their perspective. They modified the genetic template to make the clones more docile, more obedient, less likely to question orders or develop the kind of independent thinking that could undermine military effectiveness. They accelerated growth rates, so clones would mature at twice the normal human rate, reducing training time and allowing rapid replacement of casualties. They installed behavioral modification biochips that would ensure loyalty to the Republic and, though few knew it, guarantee the execution of specific orders when the time came. Django watched all this with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was being paid extraordinarily well for something that required no real effort on his part, giving blood samples and submitting to medical procedures. On the other hand, he was watching himself be transformed into a weapon, seeing his genetic legacy reduced to manufactured soldiers who would be treated as disposable equipment rather than individuals. But he had made the deal for a reason, and that reason became reality when the Kaminoans delivered on their promise. An unaltered clone, no accelerated growth, no behavioral modifications, no programming beyond what Django himself would provide through training and education. The Kaminoans designated him Alpha, but Django had a different name in mind: Boba, his son, his perfect genetic duplicate, but more than that, his second chance to create something meaningful. Later, the Kaminoans would create another unaltered clone, a female named Omega, who possessed genetic qualities that made her useful for their research. But Boba was the first, the one created specifically for Jango, and he was everything the bounty hunter had unknowingly been searching for since Galadran. Raising Boba became Jango's primary focus, though he continued taking bounty hunting contracts to maintain his skills and reputation. The contradiction between Jango, the father, and Jango the hunter created complexity in Boba's upbringing. Jango wanted his son to have a better life than he'd had, but his definition of better was shaped by his own experiences. He taught Boba to fight, to track, to survive, to operate in the galaxy's darkest corners. He prepared his son to be a hunter like himself, training the boy from early childhood in skills that most people never needed. The apartment the Kaminoans provided in Tipoca City became Jango's home, the first real home he'd had since Concord Dawn. It was sparse, functional, designed for temporary residence rather than long-term comfort. But it had everything Jango needed: privacy, access to the cloning facilities when required, and space for training Boba. Father and son would sit together in the quiet moments, and Jango would pass on everything he knew. Not through formal lessons necessarily, but through the kind of practical education that had defined his own training under Meriel. Stories about hunts that became tactical lessons, discussions about weapons that became engineering instruction, moments of connection that bonded them as Meriel's mentorship had bonded him. Jango also contributed to the clone army's development beyond just providing DNA. He assisted in training the early generations of clones, teaching them the combat techniques that had kept him alive through countless battles. The Kaminoans had programmed the clones with flash training, accelerated learning through direct neural input, but they recognized that certain skills required hands-on instruction from someone who had actually used them in combat. More significantly, Jango recruited what became known as the Kuival Dar, those who no longer exist. This was a group of 100 elite trainers, 75 of whom were Mandalorians, who would serve as military consultants for the clone army. Jango used his connections in the Mandalorian community, reaching out to warriors who had survived the various conflicts that had fragmented Mandalorian culture. Some were veterans of the true Mandalorians who had not been at Galadran. Some came from other factions. All were expert warriors willing to disappear from their former lives to train the Republic's clone soldiers. One of these trainers was Court Dawn, a former journeyman protector from Concord Dawn. Another was Cal Skirata, a Mandalorian with his own complicated relationship to Jango and the mission. Skirata and Jango had an up and down relationship. Skirata was an aggressive Mandalorian traditionalist, while Jango had evolved beyond pure traditionalism. They respected each other's skills while disagreeing about philosophy. Jango also influenced the clone army's culture in subtle ways. He included the Mandalorian song Vodayan in the Flash training regimen, altering its lyrics to inspire loyalty and purpose among soldiers serving the Republic. He contributed to the design of clone trooper armor, incorporating elements of Mandalorian shock trooper gear, most notably the distinctive T-shaped visor that would become iconic. The contract with the Kaminoans included a curious clause that would later be revealed. Jango was required to stay alive. The cloners needed access to fresh genetic material to maintain the quality of the clones they were producing. A single genetic sample would degrade over time, and while they could produce millions of clones from Jango's DNA, having the living source available allowed them to take new samples when necessary. This "stay alive" clause was somewhat ridiculous for someone in Jango's profession. Bounty hunting wasn't a desk job. It involved confronting dangerous people in dangerous situations, often with minimal backup and maximum risk. But Jango had survived this long through skill and caution. He wasn't about to get careless just because the Kaminoans wanted their investment protected. Between his work training clones and his time raising boba, Jango continued accepting bounty hunting contracts. These missions served multiple purposes. They kept his skills sharp. They maintained his reputation in the underworld. They provided opportunities to train boba by bringing the boy along on safer contracts, giving him real-world experience under controlled conditions. One such mission took Jango and young Boba to Telarath, where they met with a team of bounty hunters, a Rhodian named Nilda, a Gand named Rin, and a Chadrafan named Tiva. The job was to retrieve a Twi'lek girl who had run away with her Faline lover. It was the kind of mundane recovery work that paid well without requiring excessive violence. For Jango, it was practice. For Boba, it was education in how professional hunters operated. Boba complained about having to work with the other hunters, preferring to operate just with his father. Jango used the complaint as a teaching moment about the value of networking, about maintaining professional relationships even when you preferred working alone, about the difference between friendship and useful association. Throughout these years, Jango formed other professional relationships that would prove important. Zam Wessel, the shape-shifting hunter who had helped him during the Vosa hunt, became a frequent partner. Their relationship was complicated professional respect mixed with mutual attraction, neither fully acted on, complicated further by Zam's tendency toward recklessness that frustrated Jango's more methodical approach. They argued about tactics, with Jango constantly reminding her to be more subtle, while Zam pushed him to take risks that his cautious nature resisted. Hondo Onaka, the pirate whose operations occasionally intersected with Jango's bounty hunting, developed a healthy respect for the Mandalorian after a few encounters that left Hondo understanding Jango was not someone to trifle with. Their relationship was cordial at best, professional at worst, defined by mutual recognition that they operated in similar spheres but served different masters. Life on Kamino wasn't what Jango had expected when he accepted Tyrannus' offer. He had imagined it as a simple transaction: provide DNA, collect payment, move on. Instead, it became a decade-long commitment that transformed him from solitary hunter into something approaching a family man. The apartment in Topoka City, with its endless rain and ocean vistas, became the closest thing to a home he'd had since Concord Dawn. Boba became the purpose Rosada had encouraged him to find, the something to live for beyond credits and survival. But the galaxy was changing around them. Political tensions that had been simmering for years were approaching critical mass. The separatist movement, led publicly by Count Dooku and secretly orchestrated by Darth Sidious, was gaining momentum. Systems were seceding from the Republic. Military buildups were occurring on both sides. War was coming, and the clone army that Jango had helped create would be its primary catalyst. In 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, roughly 10 years after Jango had agreed to become the template, those tensions finally erupted. An attempt on the life of Senator Padme Amidala of Naboo set in motion events that would bring the Jedi, the Republic, and the Separatists into direct conflict. And Jango Fett would be right in the middle of it all. Geonosis, the final stand, the assassination attempt on Padme Amidala wasn't Jango's contract. It was Newt Gunry's, the Trade Federation viceroy seeking revenge for Amidala's role in the failed Naboo blockade. But Gunray had hired Jango to make it happen, and Jango had subcontracted the actual attempt to Zam Wesell, who had the ability to change her appearance and infiltrate in ways Jango couldn't. 2 attempts failed. First, an explosive on Amidala's landing platform, then poisonous cohunts delivered while she slept. Both times, Jedi Guardians Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker intervened. When the second attempt failed and Zam was captured by the Jedi, Jango was forced to make a difficult decision. Zam could identify him. Under interrogation, she would reveal who had hired her, leading the Jedi directly to Jango and, through him, potentially to Tyrannus and the larger conspiracy surrounding the clone army. This couldn't be allowed, so Jango, watching from a rooftop as the Jedi questioned his partner, fired a Kamino saber dart, a distinctive projectile that would kill her instantly, but also provide a clue about where to find him. It was a calculated sacrifice. Zam died before she could reveal anything. The saber dart would eventually lead the Jedi to Kamino, but that was acceptable. The clone army's existence would be revealed soon anyway. That was part of Sidious's plan. Better the Jedi discover it through investigation than through a captured bounty hunter's confession. Still, Jango regretted it. Zam had been more than a professional associate. They had fought together, saved each other's lives, developed the kind of bond that came from shared danger. Killing her felt like another loss in a life already defined by loss. But Jango had learned long ago that survival sometimes required sacrificing people you cared about. The galaxy was cruel that way. As expected, Obi-Wan Kenobi traced the saber dart to Kamino. The Jedi traveled to the ocean world, met with the Kaminoan administrators, and discovered the clone army's existence. When he came to Jango's apartment for answers, both men were cordial, professional, engaged in the kind of careful verbal sparring that preceded violence. Kenobi asked about Sifo Dyas, the Jedi Master who had supposedly ordered the clone army's creation. Jango claimed he'd never heard the name, which was true. He knew his contact as Tyrannus, not as Count Dooku, and certainly not as someone connected to a dead Jedi. He revealed that Tyrannus had recruited him on one of Bogdan's moons, giving enough truth to seem cooperative while revealing nothing useful. But Jango knew Kenobi's presence meant trouble. He told Boba, speaking in Fett code, a language of gestures and subtle signals that father and son had developed, that they were leaving immediately. The Kaminoans would understand. The clone army was ready for deployment. Jango's contract was essentially complete. Time to disappear before the situation became complicated. Except Kenobi followed them to the landing platform. What should have been a quiet departure became a confrontation. Jango, with Boba aboard Slave Y, faced a Jedi who was persistent enough to track him across the galaxy. The fight that followed demonstrated why Jango was worth the premium rates he charged. He employed every tool in his arsenal. blasters, flamethrower, wrist rockets, his jetpack for mobility and aerial advantage. The fight moved across the rain-slicked platform, with Kenobi using the Force and his lightsaber to counter Jango's technology and training. It was Jedi versus Mandalorian. The ancient conflict played out in modern context. Kenobi went over the edge of the platform, giving Jango the opportunity he needed. He and Boba boarded Slave One and launched, escaping Kamino before the Jedi could organize pursuit. But Kenobi had managed to attach a tracking device to the ship's hull during their fight, a detail Jango would only discover later. Their destination was Geonosis, a desert world where Count Dooku had established a stronghold with the Separatist leadership. Jango had worked for Dooku before, through the Tyrannus identity, and the Sith Lord offered protection and payment for services rendered. Geonosis seemed like the safest place to wait while the situation with the Jedi resolved itself. The journey was complicated by Kenobi's pursuit. The Jedi, flying a Delta-7 Aethersprite interceptor, tracked Slave Y through Geonosis's asteroid field. What followed was one of the most intense space battles Jango had ever engaged in. He used every capability Slave I possessed, the ship's superior maneuverability, its weapon systems, and most dramatically, the seismic charges. These weapons created devastating shockwaves that could obliterate anything caught in their radius. Jango dropped them among the asteroids, destroying massive chunks of rock and creating explosions that would have annihilated any normal pursuit craft. But Kenobi was an exceptional pilot, and his smaller, more agile ship allowed him to evade destruction through skill that Jango grudgingly respected. Eventually, Jango believed he had eliminated the Jedi threat. One particularly large explosion seemed to have caught Kenobi's ship. Jango proceeded to land on Geonosis, unaware that Kenobi had survived and followed. What Jango didn't know, couldn't have known, was that he had just delivered the Jedi to the heart of the Separatist conspiracy. Kenobi's investigation would reveal the droid army being manufactured on Geonosis, the Separatist leadership's planning for war, and Dooku's role orchestrating the entire conflict. The Jedi Order would mobilize. The clone army Jango had helped create would be deployed, and the Clone Wars would begin. For the next few days, Jango served as Dooku's bodyguard while the Separatist leadership finalized plans for the coming war. He was present during high-level meetings, witnessed the machinations of figures like Newt Gunray and Wat Tambor, understood that he was observing the orchestration of galactic-scale conflict. It was all very far removed from the simple bounty hunting he had once done. When the Jedi launched their rescue operation for Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala sentenced to execution in the Petranaki arena, Jango found himself thrust into combat again. Mace Windu led a Jedi strike team, 200 Jedi Knights who dropped into the arena to save their captured brothers and confront the Separatist leadership. The battle that followed was chaos. Jedi against battle droids, warriors fighting arena beasts, mass combat that spread across the arena floor and into the stands. Jango protected Dooku, eliminating threats to the Sith Lord with the efficiency that had made him the galaxy's premier bounty hunter. He killed Jedi Master Coleman Trebor with a precisely aimed shot, demonstrating that Force powers didn't make you invincible against a skilled marksman. But then Jango encountered Mace Windu directly. The senior Jedi Master, wielding his distinctive purple-bladed lightsaber, represented everything Jango had fought against since Galadran. This was one of the Jedi who had led the assault that destroyed the true Mandalorians. This was someone whose order had been manipulated into committing atrocities they didn't even fully understand. Jango attacked Windu with everything he had. He tried to engage in close combat, using his armor's weapon systems and his own considerable hand-to-hand skills. But during the fighting, a reek, one of the arena beasts, charged and trampled him. The damage was significant, most critically to his jetpack, which ceased functioning. The jetpack's loss changed everything. Jango's fighting style relied heavily on mobility, on using altitude and position to maintain advantage over ground-bound opponents. Without it, he was just another warrior with blasters, facing a Jedi Master who was among the Order's finest duelists. Jango fired at Windu, but the Jedi deflected his shots with contemptuous ease. He attempted to activate his jetpack to escape, but the damaged system failed to respond. And in that moment of vulnerability, with nowhere to run and no way to defend against a lightsaber-wielding Jedi operating at full capability, Mace Windu struck. One sweep of the purple blade, clean, precise, professional. Jango Fett's head separated from his shoulders, tumbling from his helmet as his body collapsed to the arena floor. The galaxy's best bounty hunter, the template for millions of clone troopers, the last of the true Mandalorians, the orphan from Concord Dawn who had survived slavery and war and lost dead in seconds, killed by the same Jedi Order that had destroyed everything he had tried to preserve decades earlier. Young Boba Fett, watching from the stands, witnessed his father's death. He ran on to the battlefield after the fighting quieted, finding Jango's helmet among the carnage. The boy cradled the empty helmet, all that remained of his father, and in that moment, his own path was set. He would become what Jango had trained him to be. He would become a hunter, and someday, somehow, he would make Mace Windu pay for what he had done. Jango's body was left on Geonosis, another casualty of the battle that marked the Clone Wars' beginning. But his legacy would far outlast his physical death. The clone army he had helped create became the backbone of the Republic's military, fighting across the galaxy in a war that would last 3 years and reshape everything. Unknown to almost everyone, those clones carried behavioral modification biochips that would ensure their compliance with Order 66, the directive to eliminate all Jedi. When Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, revealed as the Sith Lord Darth Sidious, activated that order, clones of Jango Fett would execute the Jedi Order across the galaxy. The irony was profound. Jango, who had lost his people to Jedi intervention at Galadran, had inadvertently provided the weapon that would destroy the Jedi themselves. Boba Fett would carry forward his father's name and reputation, becoming one of the galaxy's most feared bounty hunters during the Imperial era. He would wear his father's armor, fly his father's ship, and operate according to principles his father had taught him. The relationship between the two Fetts would define Boba's life, with Jango's lessons and memory serving as both guide and burden for his son. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Jango came from those who had known him in life. Rosada, had she survived, might have said that he finally found something to live for, even if he didn't get to live long enough to fully appreciate it. The true Mandalorians, had any survived Galadran, might have acknowledged that he tried to honor Muriel's legacy even as circumstances forced him down paths the Codex would never have endorsed. The clone troopers, had they been capable of truly independent thought, might have recognized that their template was more complicated than a simple warrior, a man defined by loss and transformation and the struggle to find meaning in a galaxy that seemed designed to crush such efforts. Jango Fett's life was tragedy and triumph, honor and compromise, skill and survival. He was shaped by forces beyond his control, by conflicts that preceded his birth and would outlast his death. He tried to be what Jaster Muriel had trained him to be. He failed, as everyone fails when the galaxy demands impossible choices. But in failing, he succeeded in ways he never knew, creating a legacy that would affect galactic history for generations. The boy from Concord Dawn who watched his parents die became the warrior who tried to reform Mandalorian culture. That warrior became the survivor who endured slavery and loss. That survivor became the hunter who was the best at what he did. And that hunter became the father who tried to give his son a better future, even as the galaxy prepared to tear itself apart in wars that would consume billions. He was Jango Fett, template, warrior, father, dead on Geonosis at the hands of Mace Windu, but living on through millions of clones and one perfect son who would never forget the man who raised him. The legacy. The story of Jango Fett doesn't truly end on Geonosis. His genetic legacy shaped the galaxy in ways no single individual had done before. 3 million clone troopers, all carrying his DNA, fought in the Clone Wars. They served loyally, died bravely, and when Order 66 came, they executed their programming without hesitation because Jango's genetics had been modified to ensure obedience. Those same clones became the first stormtroopers of the Galactic Empire, though they would gradually be replaced by recruited humans as the Emperor transitioned away from dependence on Kaminoan cloning. But for the crucial early years of Imperial rule, Jango Fett's face was the face of oppression across the galaxy. His skills, used to enforce Sith dominion over civilizations that had no say in their fate. Boba Fett ensured his father was never forgotten. He became everything Jango had trained him to be and more, operating as a bounty hunter feared even by the Empire's most dangerous figures. He worked for Darth Vader himself, capturing Han Solo and delivering him to Jabba the Hutt. He survived the Sarlacc pit on Tatooine, returned to reclaim his armor and his ship, and continued hunting long after most would have retired or died. The armor Jango wore, silver and blue Beskar, that had protected him through countless battles, eventually belonged to Boba, though its colors changed to the green and red that would become iconic. That armor would survive decades of warfare, would be buried in Tatooine sand and reclaimed, would mark its wearer as someone not to be trifled with. Slave Eye, the ship Jango had taken from Uvo IV and modified into one of the galaxy's most feared vessels, continued serving Boba for decades. The distinctive Fire Spray class craft with its rotating cockpit and devastating weapon systems became synonymous with bounty hunting excellence, a living monument to the man who first flew it into battle. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the one Jango never intended to create. The clone army he helped build, designed to serve the Republic, became the instrument of that Republic's transformation into empire. The Jedi he had grown to hate after Galadran were destroyed by soldiers carrying his genetic code. The Sith who had manipulated him succeeded in their scheme to dominate the galaxy, and Jango's DNA was integral to that success. Jaster Muriel would have been disappointed in much of what Jango became. The idealistic reformer who wrote the Super Commando Codex, who tried to create honorable Mandalorian warriors, who raised Jango as his son, he would have seen the bounty hunter life as a waste of potential, a surrender to cynicism that betrayed everything the true Mandalorian stood for. But Muriel might also have understood, might have recognized that the galaxy had given Jango impossible choices, that expecting someone to maintain ideals after watching everyone who shared those ideals be slaughtered was asking too much, might have seen in Jango's relationship with Boba the same paternal love that Muriel himself had shown to the orphan from Concord Dawn. The truth is that Jango Fett was neither hero nor villain. He was a man shaped by trauma, defined by loss, seeking meaning in a galaxy that seemed determined to destroy everything he cared about. He tried to be honorable and failed. He tried to be a good father and succeeded, at least until Geonosis. He tried to survive and for decades managed it through skill and will and the training Muriel had provided. His story is worth remembering not because it's uplifting or inspiring, but because it's human, because it shows how even the most skilled, most dangerous, most capable people are ultimately just trying to survive in circumstances beyond their control. Because it demonstrates that legacy can be complicated, that the consequences of our choices ripple out in ways we can never predict. Somewhere in the galaxy, long after the events of Geonosis, someone might tell stories about the bounty hunter who became the template for an army, about the Mandalorian who tried to preserve honor in a dishonorable profession, about the father who trained his son to survive in the darkest corners of civilized space, about the warrior who died not in some legendary final stand, but in a few seconds of combat when his equipment failed and his skills couldn't compensate. Those stories would be true, all of them, because Jango Fett was all those things and more, a complicated man in complicated times, doing his best with limited options and unlimited trauma. If you found this story meaningful, consider subscribing for more deep dives into Star Wars lore. There are countless stories waiting to be told, hundreds of characters whose lives shaped galactic history, thousands of moments that deserve exploration. Jango Fett's history is just one thread in the vast weave of Star Wars mythology, but it's a thread worth pulling on, worth following to see where it leads. The boy from Concord Dawn, the student of Jaster Muriel, the Mandalore of the true Mandalorians, the slave who escaped, the hunter who became the best, the father who loved his son, the template who shaped millions, the warrior who died on Geonosis. Jango Fett. Remember the name, remember the man, remember the legacy.